Welcome to Sinister Serials, where shadows whisper and every tale chills to the bone. Join us on Macabre Monday for gothic tales shrouded in mist and mystery. Twisted Tuesday will unravel your mind with psychological thrillers that blur the line between reality and madness. On Weird Wednesday, cosmic horrors from beyond the stars will haunt your dreams. Thriller Thursday brings tales of survival, where every shadow could be your last. Fantasy Friday weaves stories of ancient magic and mythical beasts. Sci-Fi Saturday launches you into dark futures and alien terrors. And on Supernatural Sunday, ghostly whispers and paranormal mysteries will leave you questioning what's truly beyond. Step into the darkness with us. The stories are just beginning.
Chapter 13. Elaine stumbled through the doorway, her heart pounding in her ears. The corridor had ended abruptly, spilling her into a cramped, windowless room. A child's fearful whimper cut through the heavy silence, echoing off the bare walls. Elaine spun around, searching for the source of the sound, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the faint yellow light flickered out, plunging her into complete darkness. The scent of mothballs and dust was suffocating, the musty air a choking presence. Faint scratches at the door suggested a terrifying unseen presence lurking just beyond the threshold. Elaine fought the rising urge to panic, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps.
Focus.
She told herself sternly.
Analyze the situation. Ground yourself in the present.
But the darkness and confined space struck a primal terror in her heart, sending her hurtling back to memories long buried. Cruel punishments, endless hours locked away in suffocating closets. The feeling of helplessness, of abandonment, threatened to overwhelm her. A rhythmic scratching started at the door, low, methodical, like an animal clawing to escape or break in. Elaine pressed herself against the far wall, her skin crawling with dread. It had to be another of the architect's tricks, a cruel manipulation designed to shatter her composure. But logic was rapidly giving way to blind, instinctual panic.
It was my fault.
Child's voice whispered from the darkness.
They're going to find me anyway.
Elaine froze, her heart in her throat. The voice was faint, broken, laced with a hopelessness she recognized all too well. A distorted echo of her own past, or another lost soul trapped in this nightmare? Driven by a desperate need to do something, to cling to some shred of purpose, Elaine forced herself to move towards the voice. Her outstretched hand brushed against cold metal, a doorknob. In the darkness, she realized with sickening clarity how much the room resembled the closets of her youth. Narrow, airless prisons that still haunted her dreams. The scratching intensified, the child's voice dissolving into choked sobs. Darkness, dust, terror beyond the door. Elaine's senses overloaded, past and present blurring into a suffocating mass. She dug her nails into her palms, pain temporarily grounding her. But the sobs dragged her back. Visceral memories of her own small body huddled in blackness, convinced she'd been abandoned forever. Silence fell abruptly, heavy with dread. Then a sinister creaking, the closet door agonizingly pushing open. Elaine's pulse roared, drowning out coherent thought. Every instinct screamed to flee, but a grim resolve took root. She would not let the architect break her, couldn't let this twisted game unravel her hard-won sanity. The door yawned wide, spilling sickly light. Elaine's next trial awaited, another cruel reflection designed to break her spirit. But she was a survivor. She'd clawed her way out of the closets of her past. She would not let them become her tomb now. Drawing a shaky breath, Elaine stepped forward to meet her fate. The door creaked fully open, and light spilled into the suffocating closet. Elaine stumbled forward, desperate to escape the cloying darkness. But as her eyes adjusted, she froze. Beyond waited a child's bedroom, eerily normal in its bright colors and familiar toys, except for the unsettling stillness that hung in the air. Elaine's instincts screamed warning. The room was too perfect, too staged. It felt like the twisted set of a horror film rather than a child's refuge. The walls were painted with cheerful pastels, but the toys were arranged with disturbing precision. Sunlight streamed through the window, yet it only served to reveal unsettling details that grew stranger the longer Elaine looked. She stepped forward cautiously, the soft carpet muffling her footsteps. The air smelled faintly of baby powder, yet a disturbing metallic note underlay it. like old pennies left to corrode. Elaine yearned to find an escape route. But the room offered no clear path, only a growing sense of unease. Her gaze fell on a tattered teddy bear perched atop the bed. Suddenly, its plastic eyes seemed to glint with unsettling intelligence, tracking her movements with malevolent intent. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. It had to be an illusion, a trick of the light. Yet the sight triggered a visceral memory of her grandmother's collection of porcelain dolls, and the way they seemed to follow her with their dead, accusing stares. Across the room, on a dainty vanity table, a music box sat open. A delicate, tinny tune filled the silence, vaguely familiar but warped, like a cherished lullaby played on a broken record. Elaine's skin prickled with unease. The melody triggered a sense of foreboding, of a childhood memory teetering on the brink of recall. Driven by a desperate need for answers and a sliver of defiance, Elaine cautiously approached the music box. She had to understand how the architect was manipulating her memories, twisting her own past into a weapon against her. But as she reached for the intricately carved wooden box, she noticed something else, a crude drawing scrawled on the wall behind the vanity. The drawing depicted a young girl, her features obscured by furious scribbles, clutching a broken doll. The lines were jagged, the colors harsh and discordant. It spoke of rage and pain, of a childhood innocence shattered beyond repair. As Elaine studied the unsettling image, the tinny melody from the music box began to distort, the notes slowing and stretching until they became a discordant mockery of the original tune. The dolls scattered across the room seemed to shift ever so subtly, their glassy eyes turning to lock onto Elaine with a chilling intensity. A wave of nausea washed over her, her stomach churning with a sickening realization. The broken doll in the drawing, the chilling music, it echoed a memory she had repressed for years, a dark secret buried deep within the recesses of her mind. Was there more to her grandmother's cruelty than childish rebellion? Had something far more sinister occurred in the shadowed corners of her childhood home? Suddenly, the music box fell silent, the absence of sound ringing in Elaine's ears with a deafening intensity. Then a child's laughter echoed from within the room's closet, sharp and tinged with madness. The hairs on the back of Elaine's neck stood on end, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. But beneath the fear, a flicker of icy anger began to take hold. Elaine refused to be reduced to a helpless child again, to let the architect's twisted machinations shatter her hard-won sense of self. She would confront whatever horror awaited her, would stare into the abyss of her own buried trauma, and emerge stronger for it. With a steadying breath, Elaine turned to face the closet, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She took a step forward, then another, her footsteps echoing hollowly in the suddenly oppressive silence. The laughter had faded, replaced by a thick, heavy stillness that seemed to press in on her from all sides. As she reached for the closet door, Elaine braced herself for the worst. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that whatever lay beyond that threshold would test the very limits of her sanity. But she also knew that she had no choice but to confront it head-on. For too long, she had run from the shadows of her past, had buried the pain and the fear beneath layers of professional detachment and carefully constructed defenses. But now, in the twisted heart of the labyrinth, those walls were crumbling, exposing the raw, bleeding wounds beneath. Elaine's hand closed around the doorknob, the metal cold and unyielding beneath her fingers. She took one final, shuddering breath, and then pulled the door open, stepping into the waiting darkness beyond. With an abrupt end to the moment, Elaine is thrown into a horrific replay of a repressed memory, one that threatens to shatter her grasp on reality and redefine her understanding of her own past. The lines between the architect's sadistic manipulations and the truth of Elaine's childhood blur, leaving her questioning the very foundations of her identity. But even as she descends into the depths of her own personal hell, a flicker of determination burns within Elaine's heart. She will not let the architect win, will not let the horrors of her past define her. She will face the darkness head-on, and in doing so, perhaps finally find the strength to break free from the chains of her own buried trauma. The child's laughter abruptly cut off, plunging the room into a heavy, oppressive silence. Elaine stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she strained to hear any sound, any indication of what fresh horror awaited her. But there was nothing, only the deafening absence of noise, broken finally by the soft click of a door latching somewhere below. Slowly, almost against her will, Elaine turned to survey her new surroundings. Gone was the eerie child's bedroom with its unsettling dolls and distorted music box. In its place was a dimly lit, sterile-looking consultation room, the kind of space that should have been comfortingly familiar to her. But something was wrong, a subtle wrongness that pervaded the very air she breathed. The room was thick with the scent of antiseptic and old paperwork, a cloying combination that turned her stomach. A single, harsh overhead light flickered intermittently, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Crumpled papers littered the floor, their contents obscured by the gloom. In the corner, a grandfather clock ticked steadily, each sound echoing the anxious beat of Elaine's own heart. She stepped forward cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. This room, while unsettling, felt more grounded in reality than the previous spaces. It was a slice of her professional world, a haven where she should have felt in control. Yet, unease prickled at the back of her neck, a creeping sense of wrongness that she couldn't quite shake. As she approached the lone desk at the center of the room, Elaine noticed a stack of files resting on its surface. The format was instantly recognizable, her own assessment notes, the kind she compiled for each of her patients. But as she drew closer, a cold tendril of fear curled in her gut. The names on the files were unfamiliar, belonging to no one she had ever treated. Elaine's training urged her to examine the files, to analyze their contents for clues about her current predicament. But fear gnawed at her, a sickening certainty that these documents contained some new manipulation designed to break her spirit. Her hand trembled as she reached for the topmost file, her fingers hovering inches from the manila surface. And then the whispers began. They rose around her like a swelling tide, disjointed fragments of speech that gradually resolved into coherent words. Voices she recognized, voices that had once been sources of guidance and support, former colleagues, professors, mentors. But the words they spoke now were ominous, laced with a disturbing undertone that sent chills racing down her spine.
Misdiagnosis.
One voice hissed, the word dripping with accusation.
Irresponsible.
Chimed in, the sound seeming to come from just over Elaine's shoulder.
Dangerous.
A third voice whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a damning indictment. Elaine recoiled as if physically struck, her hand jerking away from the files. Each word was a blow to her professional identity, a cruel twist of the knife in a wound she hadn't even known existed. But beneath the shock and the hurt, a desperate need for understanding drove her forward. With a shaking hand, she flipped open the first file, her eyes straining to make sense of the words that swam before her. But as she read, a sickening realization began to dawn. The words on the page were her own, the gentle encouragements and compassionate insights she had used countless times to guide her patients towards self-improvement. But here, in the twisted confines of the labyrinth, they had been warped and distorted into something cruel and mocking, a perversion of everything she stood for. As she watched in growing horror, the names on the files began to flicker and change, morphing into the identities of patients she knew all too well. People she had fought so hard to help, individuals she had poured her heart and soul into guiding towards healing. But the faces that stared up at her from the pages were contorted in anger and despair, grotesque parodies of the progress she thought they had made. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a chorus of condemnation that battered at Elaine's already fragile psyche. Her own words of comfort and support became twisted indictments, proof of her failings as a therapist and a human being. The voices of her colleagues, her mentors, her patients, all blended together into a cacophony of accusation, each one placing the blame for their pain squarely on her shoulders. Elaine felt her knees buckle, her body folding in on itself as if to escape the onslaught. A wave of self-doubt crashed over her, threatening to drag her under. Every success, every breakthrough she thought she had achieved with her patients, now felt like a mocking illusion, a cruel trick played by a universe determined to see her fail. She gasped for air, her lungs straining against the suffocating weight of her own inadequacy. How could she have been so blind, so arrogant, as to believe that she could make a difference? The faces in the files stared up at her, their eyes hollow and accusing. She had failed them, just as she had failed herself. But even as despair threatened to consume her, a small, defiant part of Elaine's mind rebelled against the onslaught. This was wrong, a twisted distortion of reality designed to break her. She knew her own heart, knew the truth of her intentions, and the depth of her commitment to her patients. The architect's manipulations, however cruel, could not change that fundamental fact. With a shuddering breath, Elaine forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She closed the files, each movement a deliberate act of defiance against the insidious whispers that still echoed in her mind. She would not let this break her, would not let the architect's sadistic games shatter her sense of purpose. But as she turned to face the room once more, a final voice cut through the din. Older, male, tinged with the sardonic cruelty that could only belong to the architect himself.
You were never the healer, were you?
The voice mocked, each word dripping with disdain.
Just another monster, hiding behind a mask of empathy.
Elaine froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. The accusation struck at the very core of her being, a doubts she had harbored in her darkest moments given cruel voice. For a heartbeat, she teetered on the brink, the line between reality and manipulation blurring until she could no longer distinguish between the two. But in that moment of darkest despair, something flared to life within her, a spark of determination, of righteous anger at the architect's twisted games. She would not let him win, would not let his cruel machinations define her. She was more than his plaything, more than a pawn in his sick game. The overhead light flickered wildly, plunging the room into strobing darkness. Elaine shielded her eyes, disoriented by the jarring shift. When the light steadied again, the space had transformed. Gone was the sterile consultation room with its accusing whispers and twisted files. In its place, Elaine found herself standing at the center of a macabre makeshift courtroom. Broken chairs littered the floor, their splintered wood and torn upholstery hinting at a history of violence. The walls, once a clinical white, were now covered in crude sketches, disturbing visions that echoed the nightmarish scenes Elaine had witnessed throughout the Labyrinth. Dim, flickering lights cast grotesque shadows across the room, their erratic pulsing adding to the sense of disorientation. Elaine struggled to comprehend this twisted new reality, her mind reeling from the sudden shift. Logic told her that such a transformation was impossible, that the very fabric of space couldn't be manipulated in this way. Yet doubt gnawed at her. An insidious whisper that perhaps this was all a monstrous manifestation of her own guilt, a physical embodiment of the self-recrimination that had haunted her for so long. But beneath the despair, a flicker of anger sparked to life. Surely this was all fabricated, a cruel trick designed to break her spirit. The architect knew her too well, knew exactly which buttons to push to send her spiraling into self-doubt. Yet even as she clung to that defiant thought, the seed of uncertainty took root, spreading its tendrils through her mind. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of something burnt, charred wood and smoldering paper, as if the very essence of her profession had been set ablaze. Harsh whispers echoed from every corner, a cacophony of accusation and condemnation that battered at her already fragile psyche. And then, from the shadows, they emerged. Shaky figures stepped forward, their forms distorted and grotesque. Elaine recognized them instantly. Former patients, people she had tried so hard to help, individuals she had poured her heart and soul into guiding towards healing. But here, in this nightmarish parody of a courtroom, they were twisted beyond recognition, their faces contorted with pain and fury. Each figure bore the marks of their suffering, physical and emotional wounds that mirrored Elaine's worst fears about the limits of her own abilities. Gaping sores, self-inflicted scars, hollow eyes that burned with a hatred born of betrayal. They were a gallery of horrors, a testament to the failures she had always secretly feared were her true legacy. And then, one of the figures stepped forward, and Elaine's heart stopped. It was a patient she had believed she had truly helped, someone with whom she had thought she had made a real breakthrough. But now, their voice rang out, warped and distorted, yet still achingly familiar.
Why did you abandon me? Where were you when I needed you?
The accusation struck Elaine like a physical blow, sending her staggering back. A wave of cold horror washed over her, a sickening realization of just how deeply she had failed those who had trusted her most. The figures pressed in, their whispers intensifying to a deafening roar, a relentless assault on her senses and her sanity. Driven by guilt and a desperate need to defend herself, Elaine stumbled back, her words tumbling out in a frantic plea. She recited diagnoses, treatment plans, the countless hours she had spent trying to help each and every one of them. But her words echoed emptily in the vast space, swallowed up by the tide of accusation and despair. The figures lunged forward, their decaying forms closing in like a pack of ravenous beasts. Their twisted faces contorted with rage, their grasping hands reaching out to drag her down into the abyss of her own guilt. Elaine tried to fight them off, but her strength was failing, sapped by the relentless assault on her psyche. And then the architect's voice boomed out over the din, its mocking tone echoing the worst doubts Elaine harbored about herself.
Admit it. You'll always bring others pain. You're the true monster here.
The accusation cut through the chaos like a blade, striking at the very core of Elaine's being. She felt herself crumbling, her last defenses shattering under the weight of her own self-loathing. The figures weren't attacking her physically, yet the assault on her mind was unbearable. She struggled to discern illusion from reality, her guilt making her question every decision she had ever made. Elaine fell to her knees, the figures crowding in around her like a grotesque parody of a therapy group. The burden of doubt was crushing, a physical weight that pressed down on her shoulders until she thought she might never stand again. Had she truly wrought more harm than good? Was she really the monster the architect claimed her to be? As she knelt there, surrounded by the twisted manifestations of her own failures, Elaine felt something break inside her. The last vestiges of her resilience crumbled away, leaving her raw and exposed, a wounded animal at the mercy of a sadistic predator. And then the light flickered again. When it returned, the figures were gone, but so was the courtroom. Thick, impenetrable darkness enveloped Elaine, leaving her alone with nothing but her own tortured thoughts and a single lingering question. What fresh horrors would the architect conjure from the depths of her despair? Self-doubt curdled into self-loathing, a poison that seeped into every corner of Elaine's being. She could feel her sanity unraveling, the threads of her identity coming apart at the seams. The architect's cruel manipulations had left her teetering on the brink, ready to accept the mantle of the monster he had so ruthlessly crafted for her. But even as she drowned in the darkness of her own making, a small, stubborn part of Elaine's soul refused to surrender. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let the architect's twisted games destroy her now. She would not let him win, would not let his sadistic machinations redefine her very essence. With a shuddering breath, Elaine forced herself to her feet, her limbs trembling with exhaustion and despair. She did not know what new nightmares awaited her in the depths of the labyrinth, what fresh horrors the architect had in store. But she knew that she would face them head-on, would cling to the last shreds of her humanity with every ounce of strength she possessed. The darkness swirled and thickened around Elaine, morphing into shapes that defied comprehension. Flickering glimpses of hospital hallways, distorted faces, and bloody surgical instruments taunted her, shattering any remaining sense of normalcy. The impossible, shifting landscape was a nightmare, born from the depths of her own fracturing mind. Elaine clawed at the swirling void, desperate for a single point of focus, for any proof that something in this hellish realm was real, even if it was just the architect's cruelty. But the walls melted and reformed around her, familiar objects, medical charts, anatomy posters, twisting and warping in disturbing ways. Fear now bordered on madness, a yawning abyss that threatened to swallow her whole. Elaine struggled to separate the labyrinth's illusions from her own unraveling thoughts, each memory of her work as a psychologist now tainted with the bitter sting of failure. The air was thick and humid, pressing in on her like a physical weight. A distant rhythmic pulse, like an amplified heartbeat, matched the frenzied pounding of her own. Suddenly, the floor cracked open beneath her feet, revealing a glimpse of an operating theater. A flickering monitor displayed a flatlining heart rate, the ominous silence hanging over the scene like a death shroud. Elaine's mind reeled, unable to process the impossibility of what she was seeing. Yet, the feeling of wrongness, of a horrific death occurring just beyond her reach, was overwhelming. She stood frozen, powerless to stop her mind from racing to fill the void with her own worst fears. And then, from amidst the medical equipment, the figures of her patients emerged. But they were not as she remembered them. Their bodies were grotesquely fused with machinery, their eyes mirroring the lifeless flatline of the monitor. A scream tore from Elaine's throat, a raw, animalistic sound that echoed in the distorted landscape. In that moment, a sickening realization crashed over her. Her patients had never been failures. She was the true monster, the bringer of death and suffering. The weight of that knowledge was crushing, a burden too heavy for any one soul to bear. Driven by a toxic mix of self-loathing and a primal need to negate the monstrous vision before her, Elaine stumbled towards the surgical scene. She was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, unable to resist the pull of her own guilt and despair. Her outstretched hand touched the cold metal of the operating table, and instantly the scene flashed with blinding light, then shifted again. Elaine found herself standing in a graveyard, surrounded by freshly dug mounds of earth, each one bearing the name of a patient she had lost. The architect's voice boomed out over the eerie scene, his words dripping with cruel satisfaction.
All your efforts, all your care led them here.
He taunted.
You weren't the healer, you were the harbinger of their end.
The accusation struck Elaine like a physical blow, shattering what little remained of her grip on reality. She couldn't trust her senses, her memories, or even her own identity anymore. Each step further into this nightmare world risked her mind breaking entirely, her very sense of self unraveling like a cheap sweater. Elaine dropped to her knees, the damp earth of the graveyard cold and unyielding against her skin. All her dedication, her tireless struggle to understand the twisting horrors of the labyrinth, it all felt utterly futile in the face of this final, devastating revelation. The architect had played her like a fiddle, leading her down a path of self-destruction from which there could be no return. But even as despair threatened to consume her, a tiny sliver of defiance sparked to life within Elaine's heart. The architect may have broken her spirit, but not entirely. A small, stubborn voice within her whispered,
This cannot be all there is.
It was a fragile thing, that flicker of rebellion, dangerously close to being snuffed out by the overwhelming tide of hopeless resignation. But it was there, a last dying ember of the fierce determination that had carried Elaine through every trial and torment up to this point. She clung to that ember with every ounce of strength she had left, nurturing it even as the darkness pressed in around her. She knew that her fate, her very sanity, hinged on her ability to fan that tiny spark into a flame once more. For the alternative was too bleak to contemplate. A surrender to the architect's twisted vision, an acceptance of the cruel, uncaring universe he had constructed for her. And Elaine refused to give him that satisfaction. Refused to let his sadistic machinations be the final word on her life and her legacy. So she forced herself to stand, her legs trembling with exhaustion and emotion. She glared defiantly into the swirling darkness, daring the architect to throw his worst at her. She would face it all head-on, would cling to that last shred of hope with everything she had. Because she was Dr. Elaine Mercer. A fighter, a survivor, and above all else, a healer. And she would be damned if she let anyone, least of all this twisted monster pulling strings from the shadows, take that away from her. But even as that spark of rebellion flared within her chest, Elaine couldn't shake the cold creep of uncertainty that had taken root within her psyche. The scenes of death and futility that surrounded her felt too vivid, too hideously real to be mere illusions. And if she couldn't trust herself, her own perceptions and memories, could she truly trust that defiance wasn't just another delusion conjured by a mind stretched too far? A wave of exhaustion hit her like a physical force, buckling her knees once more. In her current state, sanity itself seemed a hopeless dream, an impossible oasis forever out of reach, and part of her longed for a reprieve, however twisted. Elaine grappled with the looming temptation of a horrifying escape from the torment, one that hinted at an even darker agenda from the malevolent architect orchestrating her suffering. Elaine knelt in the damp earth of the graveyard, her body trembling with exhaustion and despair. The architect's words echoed in her mind, a twisted litany of accusations and cruel revelations that threatened to shatter her already fragile grasp on reality. She had been pushed to the brink, her sanity stretched to its limits by the relentless torments of the Labyrinth. But even as she teetered on the precipice of complete psychological collapse, a small part of her clung stubbornly to hope. It was a faint glimmer, a tiny spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished, no matter how overwhelming the darkness around her became. And then, as if sensing that last flicker of resistance, the labyrinth shifted once more. The graveyard melted away, the tombstones and freshly dug earth dissolving into a thick, cloying mist that swirled around Elaine like a living thing. She braced herself for whatever fresh horror was to come, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. But what emerged from the mist was something entirely unexpected. A door. It was a simple thing, unassuming and plain, yet it seemed to beckon to her with an almost magnetic pull. Elaine stared at it, her exhausted mind struggling to comprehend its presence in this nightmarish realm. And then, the architect's voice sounded once more, but this time it was softer, almost seductive in its tone.
You've suffered enough, Elaine.
He purred, his words wrapping around her like a warm blanket.
You've seen the truth of your failures, the futility of your efforts, but it doesn't have to be this way. There is an escape, a way to leave all this pain and torment behind.
Elaine's heart leapt at the words, a desperate hope kindling in her chest. An escape? A way out of this hellish maze? A reprieve from the ceaseless torment and self-recrimination? It seemed too good to be true. But even as that hope took root, a cold sliver of doubt wormed its way into her mind. The architect's words dripped with honey, but there was something twisted lurking beneath the surface, a note of malice that set her teeth on edge. She forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking with the effort. She approached the door warily, her hand hovering over the handle as if it might burn her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to reject this too easy offer of salvation. But the temptation was so strong, the promise of relief so alluring.
All you have to do is walk through that door.
The architect whispered, his voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once.
Leave behind the pain, the guilt, the crushing weight of your failures. Embrace the peace of oblivion, and all this will fade away like a half-remembered dream.
Elaine's fingers brushed the cool metal of the handle, a shudder running through her body at the contact. She could feel the darkness pressing in around her, the weight of her own despair threatening to crush her entirely. The thought of surrender, of giving in to the oblivion the architect offered, was suddenly so tempting. But even as her hand closed around the handle, that stubborn spark of defiance flared once more within her. This was wrong, a trap hidden in plain sight. The architect didn't want to save her. He wanted to break her entirely, to claim her mind and soul as his own twisted trophies. With a snarl of rage and determination, Elaine wrenched her hand away from the door. She spun to face the swirling mist, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unquenchable light.
No.
She growled, her voice rough with emotion but steady with conviction.
I won't let you win. I won't let you break me.
The architect's laughter filled the air around her, mocking and cruel.
Foolish girl,
He sneered,
you're already broken. You just haven't accepted it yet.
but Elaine stood tall, squaring her shoulders against the onslaught of his words.
You're wrong.
She said firmly.
I'm not broken. I'm bent. I'm battered, but I'm not defeated, and I never will be.
She took a step forward, then another, her footsteps ringing out with defiance in the eerie stillness. The mist swirled and parted before her like a living thing, revealing a narrow path that wound into the distance.
I am Dr. Elaine Mercer.
She said, her voice growing stronger with each word.
I am a healer, a fighter, and a survivor, and I will not let you, or this labyrinth, define me anymore.
With those words, she set off down the path, her head held high and her eyes fixed firmly ahead. She didn't know where it would lead her, what fresh horrors or challenges lay in wait. But she knew that she would face them head-on, armed with the unshakable certainty of her own strength and resilience. And so Elaine walked on into the unknown, leaving the temptation of oblivion behind her like a half-forgotten nightmare. The spark of defiance burned brightly within her now, a beacon cutting through the darkness like a guiding star. She had come too far, fought too hard to let the architect's twisted games claim her now. And as she walked on through the shifting mists of the labyrinth, she knew that she would emerge from this ordeal stronger than ever before, no matter what awaited her on the other side.
Thank you for joining us on another spine-chilling journey, where nightmares come to life and horror knows no bounds. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're brave enough, step through the door and subscribe to Sinister Serials, where every day brings a new flavor of fear, from macabre Mondays to thriller Thursdays. And don't forget to check out our other terrifying tales, waiting to be discovered in our library of horror. Until next time, keep the lights on if you dare.